We're back. So glad that you are joining me in reading this book. We are about halfway done with this book now. I know. Can you believe it? Halfway done with this book. All right, so let's jump right back into it. Yesterday we were reading Let the Woman Learn in Silence. So we were really studying out verses 11 and 12. And this is 1 Timothy 2, where we've got Paul talking to us, and we're going to pick right back up in point E, which says, "But I suffer not a woman to usurp authority over the man," verse 12. The Greek word for man used here is aner. That's the numerical of 435. And some theologians say that Paul used it here to speak expressly of the husband. This word makes 59 appearances throughout the epistles, 34 of which are in the King James Version, and it translates directly to husband. Of the remaining 25 occurrences, 18 are cases where the text is clearly speaking of a husband. Therefore, it seems reasonable to translate it the same way in this case. So in 1 Timothy 2:12, it may be understood as saying the woman is not to usurp authority over her husband. The context of verses 13 through 15 speak of Adam and Eve, the first husband and wife, and it points to the event of Eve usurping authority over her husband, Adam, in the fall. Thus, the woman must not usurp authority over the man, which is her husband, and be in subjection to him. This is also the word of the Lord through Paul in other epistles. Unfortunately, some translators have shown their biases along this manner. Consider the wording of 1 Timothy 2:12 in the Living Bible translation. "I never let women teach men." And in the Amplified Bible, it renders the later part of the verse as following: "The woman is to keep silent in religious assemblies." As a reminder, the words woman and man in singular, not plural context. Paul is speaking of Adam, the man, and Eve, the woman, whose relationship makes this statement applicable to married couples. The verse should not be forced to fit all church life situations, though the same principle would often apply. Further proof that Paul was referring to the husband and wife relationship in verse 15 is where the wife's being saved through childbirth is mentioned, if they, the wives, continue a Christian lifestyle. The issue here is that which pertains to authority. Paul writes that he does not permit a woman to usurp authority over the man. That is, he does not permit a wife to usurp authority over her husband. The word usurp in the verse has become a matter of great debate. The Greek word authentio, numeric is 831, is used only once in the entire New Testament. There are two prominent aspects taught by commentators on this word, and they're noted here. One, seizing the authority. The phrase usurp authority is to act on one's own authority, to exercise authority, to have mastery, or be dominating, to be an autocrat. It is to be dictatorial. Various translations render this phrase as follows. In the NASB version, it means to exercise authority over. In the Rotherham, it is have authority over. Alford, to rule over. Connie Bear's translation, to claim authority. In the Berkeley, to demeanor over. Moffat, to dictate to. Knox, to issue commands. TLB, lord it over. Williams' New Testament, practice demeanoring over a husband. In the Vine's Complete Expository Dictionary of Old and New Testament words, it means to exercise authority on one's account, to assert authority. In Liddell and Scott's English Greek lexicon, it means to have full power and authority over. In the Lamp, it is to hold sovereign authority, assume authority, act on one's own authority, presume, play the deposit, act I don't even know. And then in the buyer, it's to have authority, demeanor over someone. Most other translations simply say, for example, take authority over the man, or to take or assume and hold in possession by force or without authority over the man. To assert authority is to arrogate, to seize control, to seize authority over, in this case, by a wife over her husband, as illustrated by Jezebel mentioned in Revelation 2:20. It is a forcible seizure of power over the man, the husband. It is self-willed, arbitrary behavior of the woman spoken here, and Paul is dealing with a very strong kind of authority being exercised. Speaking on this passage, Jack Hayford comments, in the spirit, the woman is not to assert authority, not to be demeanoring. This verb occurs this one time in the entire New Testament. The intent of instruction here is against an overbearing, demeaning control of her spouse. If the idea intended had to do with the authority in the divine structure of the church, other terms more consistent with a New Testament usage would have been employed. Ernest Gentile says, it appears, therefore, that our paragraph under consideration is basically talking of the proper husband-wife relationship and their respective testimony to the world. The men are unashamedly to take the leadership in prayer, and the women are to dress moderately and maintain a demeanor that is modest and serious. Women have the need and the right to learn, and they will do so if they maintain a content and peaceful spirit, free of strife and discord, as they listen to the instructions and explanations of their husbands. Paul forbids the wives to dominate their husbands. Point 2. The originator of man. Don Russo adds some further thought to the matter of asserting authority. He writes of this radical shift regarding the role of the woman in ministry and how this major passage in Timothy has been used to silence women in church life. He comments on the fact that the valuable evidence has accumulated on the original Greek use of the word authoritin. He believes the translators have missed the original use of this word. We note some of the thoughts. Research shows that the meaning of authoritain changed dramatically over a period of 1100 years. When we first find it in the classical literature of the 6th century BC, the word usually meant to initiate or to be responsible for a murder. Two texts on women comments on the word authoritin in classical use, the word reference to the violent act of murder or suicide. In the Hellenistic period, this use of the word widens to include the performance of a criminal act concerned with personal initiative or aggression actions. Filio, in a singular reference, used the word to refer to the act of suicide. The word continues to be used to refer to actions of power against others. In these occurrences of the word close in the time of the New Testament, there is one essential element. It signifies action against or the I don't even know this perpetration of a crime against another. The word included a substantially negative element. He also continues, jumping ahead to 200 or 300 AD, this word usually meant to claim ownership of property, either rightfully or wrongfully through fraud. During the same period, it could also mean to assert power. However, around the time in the New Testament when it was written, the common theme and meaning of authoritain was to be or claim to be the author or an originator of something. To underscore the point with a pun, this appears to be the translation that is crucial in the verb of 1 Timothy 1:12. Not only have translators overlooked the prevailing meaning of this word at the time that it was written, but they have also missed the cultural context in which Paul wrote his letter to Timothy. I believe Paul is saying, I am not allowing a woman to teach or proclaim herself the originator of men. Paul goes on to say she must be in agreement, meaning agreement with the scriptures and with sound teaching in the church. He continues in this vein saying that Adam was formed first, then Eve. This statement militates against the doctrine of Eve as the protagonist. He also says Adam was not deceived, but the woman was, and sinned. This statement directly contradicts the notion that Eve was the illuminator and carrier of the new revelation. I submit that this translation is possibly the most legitimate because it fits the social context. It's true to the Greek and speaks to the troubled situation and lines up perfectly with all of Paul's other teachings and practices concerning women. As has already been seen on the history and culture of Ephesus, Gnosticism taught that Eve was the first virgin, the one who had no husband, and was the originator of life. She was the illuminator, full of wisdom, and Adam was actually given life when he saw her co-likeness lying flat upon the earth. She commanded him to live, and when Adam saw her, he said, "You will be called the mother of the living, because you are the one who has given me life." This Gnostic belief is heresy, of course, and the Bible clearly teaches that Adam was created first, then Eve, and the idea that authentian may mean originator instead of absurd authority seems to fit in light of the rest of the verse, for Adam was formed first. This passage could very well have been written to attack the Gnostic teaching that Eve was the creator of man. A further blow is dealt when Paul says in 1 Timothy 2:14 that it was Eve who was deceived. The Eve of Gnosticism could not have been deceived because she was considered to be the all-wise illuminator. This would be an endeavor to deal with the prevailing mother goddess heresy and the Gnosticism emerging in the time of Timothy and Titus. Paul was correcting either a woman or a wife who was teaching some kind of heresy. All translators and commentators recognize that the meaning of the words can and does change over the centuries. But putting together the various meanings of this word, it would seem that a certain woman, especially a wife, was seizing authority and teaching the false doctrine that women are the originator of man. Hence, Paul's refuting of the Ephesian goddess Diana and the Gnostic heresy in the verses that follow, as he emphasizes that Adam was formed first, then Eve. Adam was not deceived, Eve was. It is also worth pointing out that Paul speaks of authority in 1 Timothy 2:12, and he does not use the Greek words exousia or kyrio, which he does employ in certain other discussions of authority. Here, as we have noted, he uses the word authentian, which speaks of a specific kind of authority. Following is a list of definitions of authorian compiled from the various Greek lexicons. So if you're taking notes, the first one's going to be analytical lexicon of the Greek New Testament, and it means to have rule over, dominion. In the linguistic key to the Greek New Testament is to act on one's own authority, autocrat. It comes from autos, oneself, and entra, to arm or take weapons. It is a person who takes arms into his own hand and exercises the power to kill one another. In the word study dictionary, it means murder. absolute mastery and acting on one's own authority. It comes from autos, oneself, and entra, to arm or take weapons. It is a person who takes arms into his own hands and exercises the power to kill another. The passage deals with wives and husbands. She is not to do something that would cause her to try to master her husband. She should avoid any activity that would in any way affect her marriage relationship. In the patristic Greek lexicon, it says to hold sovereignty, authority, to assume one's own authority or act alone, to presume on one's own authority. The related word authentia means independence or on one's own initiative. It carries the idea of license, arbitrary, unauthorized, high-handed, or tyranny. It is the one who plays the despot. Bauer's Greek English lexicon means to demeanor over someone, and in the Vines, it's to exercise authority on one's own account or usurp authority. Lanny Hubbard provides the following insights. There is a difference between this word and others traditionally used by Paul for authority. Though the definitions provided seem to be varying in a degree, there's a common aspect shared among them. This word has the idea of self-initiating. This person forces themselves into a controlling position over others. They are not responding to a legitimate appointment to a position, but are violently taking the position under their own personal directive. This is tyranny and revolution. The verse then connects the act of teaching to this quality. It is not mere teaching, but teaching that promotes oneself or tears down another. In this passage, it is directed to the wives in their relationship to their husbands. The silence that is next mentioned represents a peaceful lifestyle not distributed with this activity. When we consider back to some of the characteristics of Diana's worship, such a negative look of men in marriage are found here, and it's easy to see where these ideas would have originated. In Rick Johnston's commentary, he offers the following comments. The correct dictionary definition of absurd is to take possession of, by use, to seize or hold in possession. This literal definition is probably the closest to the original Greek idea, although it does not employ the full idea of this type of authority indicated in the Greek. In most discussions of use, the idea of absurd is to throw off or preempt the authority of a man. This is not, as we will see, the idea presented in the text. It is interesting to note that the word used in this particular passage for authority is a word used only once in the entire New Testament. It is not one of 5 other words for authority used in the New Testament, and it's used to express all other aspects of authority. But when it's used here, only once in expression to a certain type of situation, which was readily understood in the New Testament times. The Greek word authentian means one who acts upon the bias of his own authority, one who does a thing himself. In classical usage, one who with his own hand kills either himself or others. It is a word from the English word autocrat, which comes to the meaning of self-govern. It is a self-styled authoritative exercise by a woman in a church at Ephesus. This is the word used to express the idea of absolute power or to sway like that of an autocrat, or playing the master is the idea connected with its sister term in the literal usage of the word. The concept of a certain type of authority here is evident. An authority that is taken or grasped by one from nowhere and exercised in a despotic manner. Thus, an artificial authority is created. For any authority exercised not having been received by another is an artificial contrived or pseudo authority, a situation in the church common to the understanding Paul speaks very plainly about. A woman is not to, on the basis of her own authority, rise up and begin to teach the congregation and thereby not recognize the headship and leadership already established in the congregation. This was the situation in the pagan temple where the woman conducted the whole religious ceremony from the worship to the teaching through the power of immorality and the spirit of divination. This same pattern was prevalent in the true church at Ephesus, the city where this type of worship was propagated. Hopefully, enough of this argument has been made on the issue of upserting authority as an act that should not be committed at all by men or women. Paul is not saying that a woman can neither exercise nor have authority. He is saying a woman must not cease the authority. A wife must not be arrogant, bossy, or demeanoring over her husband. A woman should not be self-appointed, self-styled leader. She must not teach doctrine that is contrary to the apostles' doctrine, and whatever is said out of the woman also applies to the men. Men and women may exercise authority, but neither one should usurp a position of authority or seize authority by force. This is what Lucifer, Satan, tried to do, which resulted in his fall before the throne of God. And we see that in Isaiah 14, verses 12, 13, and 14. We've already mentioned Jezebel, the wife of Ahab, as an example of a woman who seized authority. She brought about the murder of Naboth in order to secure a position in the vineyard. We see this in 1 Kings chapter 21, and then again it mentions it in Revelation 2:20. Wicked Queen Athaliah is another example of a wife who upsurted a man's authority. She seized the throne of Judah after killing all the royal seed. Read that in 2 Kings chapter 11. These are examples of the type of authority Paul is dealing with here. The authority is the church, and it must not be self-styled and authoritative, but must also be under the authority of Christ, the head of the church. Godly women must not be characterized by the qualities of the goddess Diana, as in the pagan temple of Ephesus. So, what Paul is saying in short here, if you want to take some bullet points, these are some good summaries on everything that we just talked about. Point 1. Women are to learn in a quiet and peaceful spirit and attitude. Women are to not teach that which is contrary to the apostles' doctrine. Women and wives must not usurp or seize authority over men or husbands, but each wife is to be in subjection to her husband. The husband is the head of the wife, as Adam was of Eve. And both are under the headship of Christ. Women are not forbidden to teach. In other passages, Paul talks about the importance of other women and younger women and how he acknowledged female teachers like Priscilla and her husband, Aquila, who were teachers together and ministerial companions of his at Ephesus. A wife must not be demeanoring over her husband. A wife must exercise authority as she acts under authority. But both she and her husband should be under the authority of Christ. God is the head of Christ. Christ is the head of the church and of man, and man is the head of the woman. Woman was not the originator of man. Adam was formed first, then Eve. And woman is not the illuminator of men. Adam was not deceived, it was Eve. On the basis of Kreuger and Kreuger's understanding of authority, the translation of 1 Timothy 2:12 may read, I do not permit a woman to teach or declare herself the originator of man, but she is to be in peaceful conformity with the scriptures as a respectful student. Bushnell translates it, I suffer not a woman to teach or to control a man. And Williams translates it, I do not permit a married woman to practice teaching or demeanoring over her husband. She must keep quiet. Jack Hayford translated, women need to learn to be teachable and to receive in a quiet and submissive spirit. Those things being taught further, I refuse to give place to a woman who practices a bossy and demeanoring way toward her husband. She is to be quiet. Let's read a couple more pages. We're going to go to point F now. And point F is, for Adam was first formed, then Eve. With regard to this statement, it is needful to keep in mind some of the teaching of the cult of Diana and the various group of Gnostics around Ephesus. As Don Rosso reminds us, Timothy was in Ephesus, and Ephesus was the world center of paganism, governed spiritually by the female deity, whom the Romans called Diana. The cult of Artemis taught the superiority of the female and advocated female dominion over the male. It espoused a doctrine of feminism, procreation, teaching that the goddess was able to bring forth offspring without male involvement. The cult was characterized by sexual perversion, fertility rites, endless myths, and elaborate genealogies traced through female rather than the male bloodlines. Magic and all other manner of demonic activity flourished. Also present in Ephesus was a contingent of the Jewish Gnostics, who represented the first century's equivalents of our New Age movement. So let's study this out. What does Gnostics mean? It means knowledge. The Gnostics acknowledged spiritual guides and combined the teachings of Artemis with the teachings of the Old Testament. An example of the distortion of scripture is evident in their version of the Old Testament story of Adam and Eve. In the most prevalent Gnostic versions of the story, Eve was the illuminator of mankind because she was the first to receive true knowledge from the serpent, whose Gnostics saw as the savior and revealer of truth. Gnostics believed that Eve taught this new revelation to Adam, and being the mother of all, was the propagator of the human race. Adam, they say, was Eve's son rather than her husband. This belief reflected the Gnostic doctrine that a female deity could bring forth children without a male involvement, which that's important, right? Because remember, like simple Bible course information is 1, to kill the righteous line. So that's like number one thing that they like always try to do. And then the second point is the Messiah would be fulfilled in a woman without male involvement, right? So it'll be the seed of the woman would bring forth the Messiah, which we know is Mary, not Eve. The Gnostic teachings infiltrated the church, and in writing to Timothy, Paul encouraged him to confront the people from peddling their false teachings in the church and to abolish others to turn away from myths and endless genealogies. He told him to oppose those who spoke falsely of the living God, warn about the doctrines of demons, avoid stupid, senseless controversies, and have nothing to do with old wives' tales, such as a corrupted story of Adam and Eve. Let me read that again, right? So Paul encourages them to confront people. So it's not always about love, peace, joy, happiness, right? Like it's about sometimes dealing with that is the peace, the love, and the joy. Confronting the people from peddling their false teachings in the church and to abolish others and turn away from myths and endless genealogies. He told them that they are to oppose those, who speak falsely of the living God, warn people about the doctrine of demons. So anybody that follows the Bible and they don't really believe in demons, it is scriptural. Avoid stupid, senseless controversies and have nothing to do with old wives' tales, such as the corrupted story of Adam and Eve. He urged Timothy to use the scriptures as an antidote for sound teaching, reproof, correction, and training in righteousness. One of the following commentaries looks and has comments on 1 Timothy 2:13 as this. Remember that present in the city of Ephesus were two similar heresies, which were likely infecting the church. One of them was that the goddess Diana was the fertile creator of mankind. All men were birthed from Diana, as were all women. She was the author of them all. This is what the surrounding culture believed, and this surely influenced the church, just as the strong beliefs of our present culture about sex, for example, affects the beliefs of many church members and teachers today. A second similar heresy came from the Gnostics, which was prevalent in Ephesus. And remember, Corinth and Ephesus was a major trade route, right? So they were constantly going back and forth. So these cultures were intertwined all the time together. So a second similar heresy came from the Gnostics, which was prevalent in Ephesus and throughout Asia Minor. Eve was the mother of Adam and the author of mankind. There's much more to this Gnostic teaching than is useful to consider here, but the basic theology was this. Eve was the goddess, and Eve created with the help of the serpent Adam. In fact, the God of the Bible is portrayed in these texts as an insecure minor deity who tries to prevent the workful work of Eve and the serpent are doing in creating new gods, the humans. That's actually really good. In creating new gods, the humans. This heresy, and I say that because I was born and raised in the Mormon church and culture. So one, they believe that they can become gods. And two, they actually believe that God was, you're made in his image because he was actually flesh, which he wasn't. Okay, anyways. So that's actually really interesting that, they try to prevent the wonderful work Eve and the serpent are doing in creating new gods, the humans. This heresy takes the very sin of Adam and Eve and turns it into an act to be praised, led by Eve as mother and author of mankind and the serpent as her lover. Realizing that this is a heresy, Paul will want to combat it vigorously. So let me read to you another translation of the Greek into English, which is as legitimate as a translation as the common one, but simply makes more sense in the context. I do not permit a woman to teach that she is the author of man. She must be in conformity, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. This is very much like Paul. Paul explains the error and then he corrects it. I believe this is what Paul is doing here. This heresy, among many others, was being taught that the woman was the author of man. In effect, what Paul is saying is that it is not what scripture tells us. This must be what the cult of Diana believes and what the Gnostics believe. And it's heresy to think this in the church. But it's not what the scriptures tell us. And if a woman is to teach, she must not teach that woman is the author of man, because the scripture teaches that Adam was the formed one first, then Eve. In light of these comments, the statement Adam was first formed, then Eve makes more sense to our minds. Paul gives two arguments that refute the false teachings in Ephesus, both of the cult of Diana and the Gnostics. One of Paul's arguments refer back to the creation order. The other invokes the order of the fall. So one, Adam was first formed, then Eve, and that's in verse 13. And then Adam was not deceived, Eve was. That's verse 14. Eve sinned first, and then Adam followed. In the first argument, Paul is referring back to God's order in creation. Adam was created first, and then Eve was created out of Adam. What Paul is not saying, contrary to the belief of some expositors, is that because women were created second, she's inferior to a man and is therefore to take second place as an inferior being. Paul is not advocating the permanent universal subordination of women to men. In chapter 4, we saw that Adam was not superior to Eve, nor was Eve inferior to Adam. Both were made in the image of God. They were co-equal as persons before God. This truth is demonstrated in the co-equality of the persons of the Godhead, with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit being co-equal as divine persons, but in a divine order. There's no superiority or inferiority in the Godhead. It's just a simple divine order. Under the new covenant, men and women are redemptively equal, which is of identical value and worth before God. Both Adam and Eve were sinners. Both need salvation, and both needed to be redeemed through Christ alone. Even great theologians like Martin Luther and John Calvin taught that the female sex is inferior to the male sex and should be subordinate to man. Adam Clarke also taught that God designed the man and he should have the preeminence. The structure of a woman's body plainly proves that she was never designed for those exertions required in public life. In this, the chief part of the natural inferiority of women is to be sought. Paul sets the creation order right, refuting that Gnostics and the cult of Diana, who claim that Eve was the originator of man, that women were created first, and that man is of the woman and is therefore dependent upon and inferior to her. So the creation order was Adam first, then Eve. Both were co-equal as persons in the sight of God. There's no superiority or inferiority, but co-equal, yet they functioned differently, both male and female. The first man and husband and the first wife, woman, were joint rulers of creation, and both were created in divine order. That is the point Paul reestablishes here. And we'll end there. We'll have point G that we'll come back for. And then we have probably about, let's see here, about 15 more pages in the chapter. So we may or may not do it in one full swoop on the next recording. But have a great day. Can't wait to see you back. Check you next time. Oh, before I go, don't forget, like, subscribe, share this with your friends and family. Let's